The kennel door hung open and the great gray hound stood free in the yard, ears flat, breath white, staring straight at the scarred girl carrying ashes. Thomas screamed from the mounting block and told her to run for the coal cellar before the beast took her throat. She did not run. She set the bucket down, sat on the wet gravel, and held out the hand every man in the house looked away from. The hound came forward, sniffed the ridges of old burn, and laid its head across her lap. What no chain and no lead ball could force, one whispered prayer had just done, and the man watching from the arch had heard every word the night before. Before we start, let me know where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, South Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Let's begin the story. The scarred were not permitted past the green baize door when there was company at Aldermere Hall. It was not written in any household book, and Mrs. Farthing, the head cook, had never said it plain. But Mercy Ashford had understood it from her first week in service, 13 years ago. The burn that twisted from her right wrist to her elbow and painted the back of her hand in ridges of old pink and white was not the sort of thing a duke's guests ought to see over breakfast. So she kept to the scullery, the larder, the still room, and the kitchen, when the rooms above were empty. She did not mind. The ovens knew her, and the bread rose under her scarred hands as it rose for no one else. On the 23rd of October, 1817, she was at work before the first light touched the kitchen windows. The great brick ovens squatted along the north wall like sleeping animals, and Mercy moved between them without hurry, banking coals, testing heat with her palm held flat 2 inches from the fire mouth. The air smelled of ash and rising dough and the faint vinegar bite of yesterday's scrubbing. Outside, frost sugared the kitchen garden and the stable yard beyond. She had 4 loaves proving on the board, and her sleeves rolled past her elbows when Mrs. Farthing came down the back stairs, a candle in one hand and her shawl pulled tight. "You've the ovens awake already," Mrs. Farthing said. "They were cold last night," Mercy said. "I thought I'd start them gentle." Mrs. Farthing set the candle on the table and gave Mercy the look she always gave when the girl had done something a head cook ought to have thought of first. "You'll spoil me for any other hand in this kitchen. You trained me, ma'am. If I'm any good, it's your doing. Don't ma'am me before the sun's up, child. We've 10 at table tonight, and His Grace is back from London this morning. Miss Croft sent word last night. She wants the silver service laid, and the good china down from the attic, and she's already asking why the drawing room smells of damp." Mercy shaped the first loaf with careful hands, the dough smooth and alive under her palms. Her right hand did not bend quite true at the knuckles, but it knew the work. "Will you need me front of house, or shall I keep back?" "You'll keep back," Mrs. Farthing said quietly. "Miss Croft's already made the order." Mercy nodded. She had expected nothing else. She set the loaf on the peel and slid it into the mouth of the far oven, the heat licking her wrists. "Then I'll have the bread done before 8, and I can start the stock." Mrs. Farthing poured herself a cup of small beer and stood watching the girl work. After a moment she said, "Your mother taught you your letters, didn't she?" "Yes, ma'am." "She teach you anything else?" Mercy glanced up, her hands still moving. "She taught me a verse, from the first book of Samuel, the 16th chapter." She spoke it quietly, the way her mother had spoken it to her the week before the fire, when Mercy had been 14 and whole, and afraid of what the boys in the village said about her plainness. "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." Mrs. Farthing was silent for 3 breaths. Then she said, "Your mother was a wise woman." She was. "And if she were here now, she'd tell you the same thing she told you then." Mercy set the second loaf to prove, and wiped her hands on her apron. "She'd tell me my worth's not written on my skin, it's written in the book." "Then you remember it," Mrs. Farthing said, "when Miss Croft comes through here, ordering people about like she's already mistress of this house." The kitchen filled as the sun rose. 2 scullery maids, a boot boy, the housekeeper's assistant, the under-butler. They moved around Mercy as though she were part of the furniture, and she did not mind that either. She pulled the loaves from the ovens one by one, their crusts dark and cracked and perfect, and set them on the cooling racks. The kitchen smelled like every good morning she had ever known. At 9:30, Miss Arabella Croft came down the back stairs in a morning dress the color of watered silk, her hair already pinned, her spine already straight. She was a handsome woman, though her mouth was tight. She had managed the Duke's household since the Duchess died 3 years ago, and she managed it the way a general might manage a garrison. "Mrs. Farthing," she said, "His Grace's carriage has been sighted on the Ashbourne Road. He'll be here within the hour. I want the fires laid in the library and the study, and I want the entrance hall cleared of every—" She stopped. Her gaze had landed on Mercy, who was bent over the breadboard, her scarred hand dusted white with flour. "Why is she here?" Mrs. Farthing turned from the stove. "She's been making the bread, Miss Croft. The bread is made. Send her to the scullery. She's just finishing. Now, Mrs. Farthing." Mercy set down the dough she had been kneading. She wiped her hands on her apron, rolled down her sleeves, and walked to the scullery without a word. Behind her, she heard Miss Croft say, "His Grace is not to be troubled by the sight of every broken thing in this house. Do we understand each other?" Mrs. Farthing's reply was too quiet to hear. Mercy spent the rest of the morning in the scullery, scrubbing pots and scouring the great roasting pans until her hands ached. She did not think about Miss Croft's words. She had heard worse. At midday, she ate bread and cheese standing at the scullery window, looking out over the kitchen garden and the path that led to the stable yard. She could see the kennel from here, a low stone building with a slate roof and an iron-barred door. The Duke's hound was kept there. No one went near it if they could help it. It had bitten 2 grooms and a visiting coachman, and the Duke had ordered it chained. Mercy had never seen the animal up close, but she had heard it at night sometimes, a low, steady howling that made the scullery maids cross themselves. She worked until the light began to fail. The house above her was alive with movement, boots on stairs, doors closing, the rumble of the Duke's voice somewhere distant. She did not see him. She did not expect to. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Farthing released her. Mercy pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the October cold. The kitchen yard was dark and quiet, the cobbles slick with frost. She did not go to the servants' hall. She walked instead toward the kennel, her breath clouding in the air, her hands folded under her shawl. She had been thinking about her mother's verse all day. She had been thinking about it for longer than that. The kennel stood at the edge of the stable yard, beneath a stone arch that framed the night sky. A single lantern burned above the door. Mercy stopped 3 paces back and stood in the cold, looking at the iron drop bar that held the door shut. Inside, she could hear the hound breathing, a low rhythmic sound like a bellows. She had not come here to open the door. She had come here to pray. She whispered the verse first, to steady herself. "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." Then she closed her eyes and spoke the prayer she had been carrying for 3 years. "Lord, I am asking you plain. Send me one living thing that comes to me willing, not driven, not bought, not dutied into it, willing. One soul that would look at this hand and not turn away. One that would kneel on the gravel with me and not count the cost. One that would not send me back to the stairs when company comes. Just one, Lord, before I die unchosen. That is what I am asking." She opened her eyes. The lantern above the door swayed in the wind. The hound had gone silent. Behind her, gravel crunched beneath a boot. Mercy turned. The stable arch framed a tall shadow, broad-shouldered and still. She could not see his face. For a moment neither of them moved. Then the shadow spoke, and the voice was low and careful, and scraped clean of anything she could name. "Say that again." Mercy's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She did not know who he was. A groom, perhaps, or the kennel master she had heard the Duke had sent for from Scotland. She pulled her shawl tighter and lifted her chin. "I was praying, sir," she said. "I didn't know anyone was listening." The shadow stepped forward into the spill of lantern light, and she saw him plain. A man past 40, dark-haired, with a face that might have been handsome once before grief had carved it lean. He wore a black coat and no hat, and his eyes were the color of winter steel. He looked at her the way a man might look at something he had lost and found again in a place he did not expect. "I've been listening," he said, "for 3 years." By 6 o'clock the next morning, the frost had turned to a thin, cold mist, that hung low over the gravel of the stable yard. Mercy Ashford carried the heavy bucket of iron-shrunk ashes from the kitchen stoves, her boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. Her head was down, her woolen shawl tucked tight into her apron string to keep the wind from her neck. She was 10 paces from the ash pit when she heard the shout. It was Thomas, the undergroom, and his voice was thin with terror. He was standing on the mounting block near the carriage house, a 3-tined pitchfork held out like a shield. "Don't move, girl," he whispered. "Don't you make a sound." Mercy stopped. She looked toward the stone arch of the stables. The heavy oak door of the kennel was swinging wide, its iron staple hanging loose where the dry timber had split. In the middle of the yard stood the Duke's hound. He was a great gray deerhound, the color of rain-washed slate, with scars across his muzzle and a chest like the prow of a boat. His ears were flat against his skull, and his breath came in white, ragged plumes. He was looking directly at her. "Run for the coal cellar," Thomas hissed from the mounting block. "He'll have your throat if you run slow, but it's your only chance." Mercy did not run. She knew that running made a beast believe you were something to be hunted, and she knew something else, though she could not have named the hour she learned it. She knew what it was to be kept behind a closed door because people were afraid of what you might do if you were loose. Slowly, without taking her eyes from the hound's yellow stare, Mercy set her ash bucket on the cobbles. She did not raise her hands. She did not call out. She simply sat down on the cold, wet gravel of the yard, her wool skirt spreading around her like a dark pool. "Are you mad?" Thomas shouted, his pitchfork shaking. "Get up!" Mercy ignored him. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting flat on her knees. She turned her right hand over, exposing the scarred palm, the twisted pink skin catching the gray light of the dawn. She held it out, 3 inches from her skirt, flat and steady. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind under the arch. "Let him come willing." The deerhound took 3 slow steps forward. His head was low, his tail straight and stiff. He growled, a deep, rattling sound that she could feel in the gravel beneath her. He was 5 feet away, then 3. He stopped, his black nose twitching as he caught the scent of wood ash and yeast on her apron. Mercy did not flinch. She kept her eyes on his, her hand held out like a small, flat shelf. The beast leaned forward. His cold, wet nose touched the center of her scarred palm. He stayed there for 2 breaths, his whiskers tickling her wrist. Then, with a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to rise from the depths of his ribs, the tension left his shoulders. He did not snap. He did not growl. He lowered his heavy hindquarters onto the gravel, then his chest, and finally laid his great, scarred head directly across her lap, his chin resting near her knee. Mercy let out her breath. She raised her left hand, her whole hand, and began to stroke the rough gray wire of his ears. "Good boy," she murmured. "You're just cold, aren't you?" A shadow fell across her. Mercy looked up. The man from the stable arch stood 3 paces away. He was bareheaded in the mist, his dark hair damp, his black coat buttoned to the chin. He looked down at her, then at the hound, then at her hand resting on the beast's neck. He did not look away from her scars. He looked at them with a strange, heavy gravity, as though he were counting the lines of the burn. "Why did you sit?" he asked. His voice was the same low, scraped rasp she had heard the night before. "I've been asking God for something, sir," Mercy said. "I thought perhaps he'd sent it." The man did not laugh. He did not call her foolish, as any of the other grooms would have done. He walked slowly to the kennel door, examined the split timber where the staple had pulled free, and then came back to her. He knelt on the wet gravel, his fine woolen trousers soaking in the moisture, and stretched out his own hand. The hound did not move. He kept his head firmly in Mercy's lap, his yellow eyes fixed on the man with a cool, warning stillness. "He's drawn blood from 5 men since Michaelmas," the man said quietly. "My kennel master said he was fit for nothing but a lead ball in the brain." "He's not mad, sir," Mercy said, her hand still moving behind the dog's ears. "He's just been kept in the dark too long. It makes a dog forget what a hand is for." The man looked at her hand again, where the pink ridges of the old burn ran up beneath her sleeve. "Who taught you that?" "My mother, sir. She said everything God made wants to be known, even the wild ones." He was silent for a long moment, his steel-gray eyes searching her face. Then he stood up, offering her his hand to help her from the gravel. He did not shrink from her scarred skin when his fingers closed around hers. He pulled her up steadily, his grip warm and dry. "I am Nicholas," he said. He did not add his title, and she did not ask for it. A scullery maid did not ask a steward or a master of horse for his credentials. "What is your name, girl?" "Mercy, sir. Mercy Ashford. I work the ovens." "Well, Mercy Ashford," he said, looking down at the hound that was now standing close against her skirts. "It seems you have a new charge. The kitchen can spare you for an hour after the bread is drawn." "Yes, Mr. Nicholas," she said. For the next 6 days, the kitchen saw very little of Mercy after 9 o'clock. Miss Croft was occupied with the guest lists for the coming house party, and Mrs. Farthing quietly covered Mercy's absence by sending the younger girls to scour the vegetable bins. Every morning, Mercy walked to the kennel with her mother's small, dark calfskin Bible held flat against her apron. She set it on the oak bench beside the kennel door, its brass clasps catching the pale autumn sun, while she worked with the hound. The beast, whom Nicholas called Garth, would not eat from any hand but hers. She would sit on the bench, her Bible beside her, and break her piece of breakfast bread into small crusts, feeding them to him one by one. Nicholas came every afternoon. He did not watch from the arch anymore. He sat on the other end of the bench, his long legs stretched out, his hands in his pockets. He spoke very little at first, but he watched her. He watched the way her scarred hand did not hesitate when she reached to clean the dirt from Garth's eyes. "You carry that book everywhere," he said on the third afternoon, nodding toward the dark leather on the bench between them. "It was my mother's, sir," Mercy said. "She had her name written in the front, and the date she was wed. I like to have it near." "And do you find what you're looking for in it?" "Usually, sir, when I'm patient enough to read past the parts I think I know." Nicholas looked out over the yard, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "I've read it. I've read it from the first page of Genesis to the last of the Revelation. My father made sure of that. But I never found much in it for a house that's already fallen." Mercy set her hand on the cover of the Bible, her thumb holding the brass clasp steady. "My mother used to say, the book isn't a map of where we've been, sir. It's a promise of who's going with us. And if you ask for something," Nicholas said, his voice dropping into that quiet, wounded hollow she had begun to recognize, "and you ask for 3 years without so much as a whisper in return, then I suppose you have to ask yourself what you were really wanting," Mercy said. "I asked God for a sign that my house could be mended," Nicholas said, his eyes fixed on the distant hills beyond the yard wall. "He's been quiet for 3 years. I've stopped expecting an answer." Mercy looked at him. He was a man of rank. She could tell by his boots and the fine linen of his cravat, but his shoulders were bent as though he carried a sack of wet salt. "Maybe the answer's already come," she said softly, "and you haven't called it by name yet." He turned his head to look at her, but she had already stood up to lead Garth back into his bay. That night, in the great library at the front of Aldermere Hall, Nicholas sat late by a dying fire. The room was vast, lined with 3,000 volumes in calf and gilt, but it felt cold to him. He had spent 3 years in this room, watching the dust settle on his wife's footstool and the empty cradle that had been carried to the attic. He reached out and took the great family Bible from the side table. It was a massive thing, bound in black morocco with the Hartwell crest tooled in gold on the board. He opened it, the heavy pages whispering in the quiet room. He did not look at the register of births and deaths. He turned instead to the Psalms, his fingers tracing the columns until they stopped at the 147th Psalm, the 3rd verse. He read it silently, his lips moving over the words in the firelight. "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." He closed his eyes. In the dark behind his eyelids, he did not see the face of his late Duchess, or the child he had never held. He saw only a scullery girl sitting on the wet gravel, her burned hand held out to a beast that had bitten every man who tried to chain it. On the 1st of November, 9 days before the house party was to begin, the household was seized by a kind of ordered frenzy. Every carpet in the drawing rooms was taken up and beaten in the yard. The good china came down from the attic. The silver was counted and polished and counted again. Miss Croft moved through the rooms like a ship under full sail, giving orders in a voice that left no room for argument. Mercy kept to her work. She was at the ovens by 5 each morning, and by 9 she was in the yard with Garth. The hound would not eat unless she brought the bowl herself. He followed at her heels when she walked to the ash pit, and he lay in the sun outside the scullery door while she scrubbed pans. The grooms had stopped calling him the Duke's Hound. They called him Mercy's dog now, and she did not correct them. Nicholas still came every afternoon, though he came later now. He said very little, but he watched her. She had begun to notice the way he stood when she spoke, very still, as though he were trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. On the afternoon of the 1st, Mercy was sitting on the bench outside the kennel, mending a torn apron with careful stitches, when the under-butler came into the yard. He was a thin, nervous man named Billings, and he was carrying a silver tray with a sealed letter on it. He stopped when he saw Nicholas leaning against the kennel wall, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on Mercy's needle as it moved through the linen. "Your Grace," Billings said, and then froze. Nicholas turned his head slowly. His eyes were cold. Billings went white. Forgive me, sir, I thought. You thought I was in the study," Nicholas said. His voice was flat and very quiet. "You will think that again, Billings. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir." "Yes, sir." Billings fled. Mercy looked up from her mending. "He called you Your Grace." Nicholas did not look at her. He straightened, brushed the dust from his sleeve, and said, "He was mistaken." "Was he?" "Leave it, Mercy." She set her needle down. She was not a fool. She had worked in great houses long enough to know what Your Grace meant, but she could not make the words fit the man who sat on a kennel bench and talked to her about prayers that went unanswered. She opened her mouth to ask him plain, but he had already turned and walked away across the yard, his black coat disappearing through the arch. That evening, as Mercy was carrying a basket of turnips from the root cellar, Miss Croft stepped into her path. "Put that down," Miss Croft said. Mercy set the basket on the stone flags of the passageway. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Croft folded her hands at her waist. She was dressed for dinner, her hair elaborately pinned, a fine Norwich shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked at Mercy the way a woman might look at a stain on good linen. "You have been seen," Miss Croft said, "in the stable yard, frequently, with His Grace's hound." Mercy said nothing. "The Honorable Miss Letitia Blanchard and her mother, Lady Blanchard, will arrive on the 10th of November, Miss Croft continued. "They will be accompanied by Sir Geoffrey Ormond and his sister, and by the Reverend Dr. Cornelius Blake, who was the late Duchess's cousin. They are guests of the highest rank, and this house will be run as a house of rank ought to be run. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "You will not be seen in the yard after the 9th. You will not be seen in the entrance hall, the morning room, the drawing rooms, or the gallery. If you are called to carry something to the upper floors, you will use the servants' stair, and you will not linger. The hound will be returned to the kennel and chained, as it was before you meddled with it." Mercy felt something cold settle in her chest. "Mr. Nicholas asked me to tend the dog, ma'am. I was only doing as I was bid." Miss Croft's mouth tightened into a bloodless line. "Mr. Nicholas, as you call him, is His Grace the Duke of Aldermere. He is the master of this house, and of 4,000 acres besides. You are a scullery maid with a crippled hand. I do not know what you think has been happening in that yard, but I will tell you what it looks like from where I stand. It looks like a girl who does not know her place, and if you do not learn it before the 10th, you will be dismissed without a character." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked back toward the green baize door, her skirts whispering against the stone. Mercy stood alone in the passage, the smell of damp earth and old turnips rising from the basket at her feet. She pressed her scarred hand flat against the cold wall and closed her eyes. The Duke of Aldermere. She had been speaking to the Duke of Aldermere as though he were a steward. She had told him what her mother said about dogs and wild things. She had sat beside him on a kennel bench and corrected his theology. And he had let her. She did not know whether to laugh or weep, so she did neither. She picked up the basket and carried it to the kitchen. The 9th of November came cold and clear, with a hard white sky that promised snow before nightfall. Mercy was in the scullery, her arms deep in a basin of greasy water, when she heard the commotion in the yard. Shouting. The scream of a horse. The rattle of wheels on gravel moving too fast. She dropped the pot she was scrubbing and ran. The yard was chaos. A hired post-chaise had come through the gate at speed, the horses wild-eyed and lathered, the postilion sawing at the reins and cursing. The off-leader had a broken blinker and was shying hard to the left, dragging the team toward the mounting block. 2 grooms were running after the carriage, shouting. And in the center of the yard, directly in the path of the plunging horses, stood Garth. The hound had slipped through the open gate of the kennel. He stood rigid, his ears flat, his hackles raised, barking at the horses in short, furious bursts. Mercy did not think. She ran. She heard Thomas shout her name. She heard the crack of the postilion's whip. But she did not stop. She ran straight into the path of the leaders, her arms outstretched, and threw herself between the plunging hooves and the dog. She had time for one short, desperate prayer. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing?" she whispered, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." Then she grabbed Garth by the loose skin at his neck and dragged him sideways with all her strength. The horses thundered past, close enough that she felt the heat of their breath and the sting of gravel flung up by their hooves. The wheel of the chaise missed her by inches. She fell hard onto her side, Garth's weight pinning her to the ground, her shoulder striking the edge of a cobblestone. The pain was sudden and white-hot, but she did not let go of the dog. The chaise clattered to a halt near the carriage house. The postilion was still cursing, and someone was shouting for the head groom. But Mercy heard none of it. She was aware only of Garth's rough tongue licking her face, and of the sound of boots running across the gravel. Nicholas dropped to his knees beside her. His face was bone-white, his breath coming hard. "Don't move," he said. His hands were shaking as he reached for her. "Mercy, don't move. Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she said, though her shoulder was screaming and her ribs felt like they had been kicked by a mule. "Is Garth—" "Damn the dog," Nicholas said. His voice cracked. "Are you hurt?" She tried to sit up and gasped. Nicholas slid one arm behind her shoulders and lifted her as gently as if she were made of glass. He knelt there on the filthy, wet gravel in his fine wool trousers and his black coat, and he held her against his chest while he ran his free hand over her arms, her ribs, her shoulders, checking for broken bones. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice was rough and low, and she realized with a shock that he was furious. "You ran into the path of a bolting team for a dog." "He's not just a dog," Mercy said. "He's the first living thing that ever came to me willing." Nicholas went very still. His hand, which had been moving carefully along her forearm, stopped. He looked down at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "Say that again," he said. "I prayed for one living thing to come to me willing," Mercy said. "And God sent him. I wasn't going to let him die for want of my courage." Nicholas's grip on her tightened. He looked at her as though he were seeing her for the first time, and as though he had been looking for her all his life, and had only now found her. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known," he said quietly. "I'm just a scullery maid, Your Grace." "Don't," he said, and his voice was suddenly raw. "Don't call me that. Not you." He helped her to her feet, but he did not let go of her hand. His fingers were warm and strong around her scarred palm, and he held on as though he had no intention of ever releasing her. Mrs. Farthing came running from the kitchen, her apron flying. 2 grooms were leading the horses away. The postilion was shouting something about a broken axle. But Nicholas did not move. He stood in the center of the yard, his hand wrapped around Mercy's, and he looked at her as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "Mercy," he said, "I need to tell you something." "I know who you are, sir," she said softly. "Miss Croft told me." "Then you know what I'm about to ask is impossible." "Yes, sir. And you know that I'm going to ask it anyway." She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. "Yes, sir." But before he could speak, Miss Croft's voice cut across the yard like a blade. "Your Grace," she called from the doorway of the house. "Lady Blanchard's carriage has been sighted on the Ashbourne Road. She will be here within the hour." Nicholas closed his eyes. His hand tightened once, briefly, around Mercy's. Then he let her go. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Have Mrs. Farthing see to your shoulder. I will speak to you tonight." Mercy nodded. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, Garth at her heels. She did not look back, but she could feel his gaze on her all the way to the door. Lady Blanchard arrived at 4:30 in a coach and four with her daughter, her lady's maid, and enough luggage to outfit a small battalion. She was a tall, handsome woman of 50, with iron-gray hair and a voice that could carry across a ballroom. Miss Letitia Blanchard was 22, fair-haired, and blessed with the kind of delicate beauty that made men forget their own names. Sir Geoffrey Ormond and his sister arrived an hour later, followed by the Reverend Dr. Cornelius Blake, who had been the late Duchess's cousin, and who spoke of her memory in every third sentence. Mercy saw none of them. She was kept to the scullery and the still room, scrubbing pots and chopping vegetables while the household above her came alive with laughter and music. She could hear the pianoforte in the drawing room, and the low rumble of conversation at dinner, and the light, pretty sound of Miss Blanchard's voice asking His Grace whether he still kept hounds. Nicholas did not come to the yard. Mercy did not expect him to. He was the Duke of Aldermere, and he had a house full of guests who had been invited to see him married. On the third day of the house party, Mrs. Farthing came into the scullery at 10:30 in the morning. Her face was tight. "You're wanted upstairs," she said. Mercy looked up from the basin of knives she was scouring. "Ma'am? Miss Croft says one of the guests has asked to see the Duke's hound. His Grace is in the stable yard now, and the beast won't come out of the kennel for anyone but you. You're to bring him out." Mercy dried her hands on her apron. Her heart was beating hard and fast, but she kept her face calm. "I'll go now." "Mercy," Mrs. Farthing said quietly, "keep your head down and say nothing unless you're spoken to. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." The stable yard was full of people. Lady Blanchard stood near the mounting block in a dove-gray walking dress and a spencer trimmed with sable. Miss Letitia was beside her, holding a lace parasol against the cold November sun. Sir Geoffrey and his sister were examining the Duke's matched bays in their stalls. The Reverend Dr. Blake stood near the kennel door, his hands folded behind his back, nodding gravely at something Nicholas was saying. Nicholas saw Mercy the moment she stepped through the arch. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Ah," he said, "here she is." Mercy walked forward, her hands folded at her waist, her gaze fixed on the gravel. She did not curtsy. Scullery maids did not curtsy to guests unless they were directly addressed. "This is the girl who gentled the animal?" Lady Blanchard asked. Her voice was not unkind, but it carried the faint tone of someone examining a curious specimen in a museum. "She is," Nicholas said. "What is her name?" "Mercy Ashford, my lady," Mercy said quietly. Lady Blanchard looked her over. Her plain gray wool dress, her patched apron, her hands red and chapped from washing in lye water. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Mercy's right hand, and Mercy saw the faint flicker of distaste cross the woman's face before she smoothed it away. "Well," Lady Blanchard said, "how remarkable. And she is employed in the kitchens, I take it?" "She is," Nicholas said. His voice was level, but there was something beneath it that made Mercy's chest tighten. "How very industrious," Lady Blanchard said. She turned to her daughter. "You see, Letitia, even the lowest servants can be taught to be useful if one takes the time to train them properly." Miss Letitia smiled. It was a sweet, empty smile, the kind that meant nothing at all. "Yes, Mama." Mercy felt the words like a slap. "The lowest servants." She kept her eyes down and said nothing. "Shall we see the hound, Your Grace?" the Reverend Dr. Blake asked. "Of course," Nicholas said. He looked at Mercy. "Miss Ashford, if you would." Mercy walked to the kennel door and lifted the latch. Garth was lying in the corner of his bay, his head on his paws. When he saw her, his tail began to thump against the straw. "Come, Garth," Mercy said softly. The hound stood and walked to her, pressing his great gray head against her skirt. She rested her hand on his neck and led him out into the yard. He ignored the guests entirely. He sat at Mercy's feet and leaned his weight against her legs, his yellow eyes fixed on Nicholas. Lady Blanchard took 3 steps back. "Good heavens, he's enormous." "He's a deerhound," Nicholas said. "They were bred to hunt in the Highlands." "And he was quite savage before, I understand?" "He was," Nicholas said. He was still looking at Mercy. "Then the girl has done well," Lady Blanchard said. "You must be very pleased, Your Grace. A well-trained servant is worth her weight in gold." She turned to Miss Croft, who had appeared at the edge of the yard. "Miss Croft, you are to be commended. The household is admirably managed." Miss Croft inclined her head. "You are too kind, my lady. Now," Lady Blanchard said briskly, turning back to Nicholas, "I believe we were to walk to the Folly before luncheon. Shall we?" Nicholas hesitated. For a moment, Mercy thought he would refuse. But then Miss Letitia stepped forward, slipping her small gloved hand through his arm, and smiled up at him with those wide, guileless blue eyes. "I have been longing to see the view from the hill, Your Grace," she said. Nicholas looked down at her. Then he looked at Mercy. His face was unreadable. "Of course," he said. They walked away. Lady Blanchard, Miss Letitia on the Duke's arm, Sir Geoffrey and his sister, the Reverend Dr. Blake. Miss Croft followed at a distance, her spine straight as a pike. Mercy stood alone in the yard with Garth at her feet and the cold November wind pulling at her skirts. She had been dismissed without a word. She had been looked at and spoken about as though she were a piece of furniture that had been polished to a tolerable shine. The lowest servants. She led Garth back into the kennel and latched the door. Then she walked back to the scullery, her hands shaking, her throat tight with something she would not name. Mrs. Farthing was waiting for her in the passage. "Well?" the older woman asked. "They wanted to see the dog," Mercy said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and distant. "I brought him out. They looked at him, then they left." Mrs. Farthing studied her face. "And His Grace?" "He was very polite," Mercy said. "Mercy, I need to get back to the knives, ma'am. They're only half done." She did not wait for an answer. She walked into the scullery and shut the door. That night, alone in the narrow attic room she shared with two other maids, Mercy knelt beside her bed and opened her mother's Bible. The brass clasps were cold under her fingers. She turned to the place where her mother had pressed a sprig of lavender between the pages of the 16th chapter of the first book of Samuel. The lavender had turned brown and brittle. It crumbled when she touched it. She read the verse again, the one her mother had taught her. "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." She closed the book. "I thought you heard me, Lord," she whispered into the cold dark. "I thought you sent the dog. I thought you sent him." She pressed her scarred hand flat against the cover of the Bible. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the dog was all you meant to give me, and I was a fool to think it meant more." She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears changed nothing. She climbed into bed and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the other girls breathe in the dark. 3 floors below, in the great library at the front of the house, Nicholas sat alone by the fire. The guests had retired for the night. Miss Croft had gone to her room. The house was silent except for the ticking of the long case clock in the hall. He had spent the evening smiling and nodding and making conversation about nothing. He had walked with Miss Letitia to the Folly and back. He had listened to Lady Blanchard describe the excellent management of her own household in Northumberland. He had endured the Reverend Dr. Blake's reminiscences about the late Duchess, and he had not once corrected the man when he suggested that it was time His Grace considered remarrying for the sake of the estate. He had done everything that was expected of him, and he had thought, all the while, of Mercy Ashford standing in the stable yard with her head down and her hands folded, being spoken about as though she were not there. The lowest servants. He stood and walked to the great bookshelf that lined the north wall. The family Bible was there, the same black morocco volume he had opened the night after Garth had laid his head in Mercy's lap. He carried it back to the fire and let it fall open in his hands. It opened to the 16th chapter of the first book of Samuel, as though the spine had been bent there many times before. He read the 7th verse slowly, aloud, in the silent room. "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." He closed his eyes. He had asked God for a sign that his house could be mended, and God had sent him a scullery maid with a burned hand, and a faith that put his own to shame. She had prayed for one living thing to come to her willing, and she had been given a beast that every man on the estate feared. She had risked her life for that beast because she believed it was an answer to prayer, and he had stood in the yard and let Lady Blanchard call her the lowest servant. He had been looking at the outward appearance. He had been looking at rank and station and what the world would say. He had been blind. "Forgive me," he said quietly. He sat for a long time, the Bible open on his knees, the fire burning low. Then he took a sheet of paper from the writing desk, dipped his pen, and wrote 4 lines in a firm, clear hand. When he was finished, he folded the paper, sealed it with wax, and wrote her name on the front. He rang for the night footman and gave him instructions. The note reached Mrs. Farthing an hour later. She carried it upstairs to the attic and knocked softly on the door of the maid's room. Mercy was still awake. She came to the door in her nightdress, a shawl pulled over her shoulders. Mrs. Farthing handed her the sealed paper. "From His Grace," she said quietly. "He asks that you come to the library." Mercy looked down at the note. She did not open it. "Tell His Grace," she said, her voice steady, "that I am grateful for his kindness, but I cannot come. Tell him I know my place, and I will keep to it." Mrs. Farthing's face softened. "Mercy." "Please, ma'am," Mercy said. "Just tell him." She stepped back into the room and closed the door. Mrs. Farthing stood in the narrow hallway, holding the unopened note, and for the first time in 30 years of service, she did not know what to do. On Sunday morning, the bells of St. Jude's Estate Chapel rang out over the frost-bitten valley of Aldermere. The air was so cold, the sound seemed to crack like glass against the hills. Before the first bell had finished tolling, Mrs. Farthing stood in the vestry of the chapel. Nicholas was there, his black coat brushed, his cravat tied with the neat precision his rank demanded. But his face was gray, and he stood by the narrow Gothic window looking out at the graves as though he had not slept at all. Mrs. Farthing reached into her apron pocket and drew out the folded paper, its red wax seal still unbroken. She laid it on the oak table between them. She did not say she was sorry. She simply said, "She delivered your message, Your Grace." Nicholas did not touch the paper. He kept his eyes on the frost on the window pane. He said, "And what did she say, Mrs. Farthing?" Mrs. Farthing spoke the words flat, the way Mercy had given them to her. "She said she was grateful for your kindness, but she could not come. She said she knows her place, and she will keep to it." Nicholas closed his eyes. His shoulders, which had been square since he was a boy of 16, sank. He said, "Thank you, Mrs. Farthing. You may go." The chapel was full for the morning service. The kitchen servants and the stable hands sat in the narrow wooden gallery at the back, where the wind whistled through the slates. Mercy sat in the corner of the last bench, her shawl pulled tight over her bruised shoulder, her mother's small Bible held flat against her knees. 3 floors below them, in the family pew, Nicholas sat with his guests. Lady Blanchard wore a bonnet of plum-colored velvet. Miss Letitia sat beside her, her hands folded in a white muff, her face serene and beautiful. Miss Croft sat on the other side, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The Reverend Dr. Cornelius Blake preached on the duty of the low to the high, and the high to the low. He spoke of order and station, and the wisdom of a God who had made some to govern and others to serve. Mercy did not listen to the words. She looked at the carved stone angels on the font, and she thought of her mother, and she wondered if the chapel in heaven had a gallery for the scullery maids. When the service was ended, the congregation filed out into the bright, cold sunshine of the churchyard. The guests came first, their silk and velvet skirts rustling on the gravel. The servants followed at a distance, keeping to the grass border to let the carriages draw up. Lady Blanchard's coachman was already on the box, his whip held at the angle of respect. Miss Letitia stood near the step, waiting for Nicholas to offer his hand to help her in. But Nicholas did not walk to the carriage. He stood on the chapel steps, his bare head catching the pale winter sun. He looked across the crowd of guests, past the parson, past his cousin Arabella, until his gaze found the girl in the gray wool dress standing near the churchyard wall. He walked down the steps. He did not look at Lady Blanchard, who spoke his name as he passed. He did not look at Miss Letitia, who took a half-step toward him. He walked straight through the middle of the crowd, the guests parting before him in a silence that was sudden and absolute. He stopped 3 feet from Mercy. She did not run. She stood by the low stone wall, her Bible held flat against her chest, her face pale but steady. Nicholas looked at her. Then, slowly, with the deliberate grace of a man who had finally found his road, he lowered himself onto his knees on the damp, rough gravel of the path. The silence in the churchyard was so deep that Mercy could hear the crows in the elms half a mile away. Nicholas did not look at the gravel. He did not look at his guests, who were staring at him with their mouths open. He looked up at Mercy, his steel-gray eyes shining with a light she had never seen in them before. He reached out and took her right hand, her scarred hand, and held it between both of his. He spoke, and his voice carried across the quiet churchyard, so that every groom and every lady heard him plain. He said, "I have spent 3 years looking on the outward appearance, Mercy, but the Lord has taught me to look upon the heart." He pressed her hand to his chest, and she could feel the steady, hard beat of his heart beneath his wool coat. He said, "I want to be that one living thing that comes to you willing, Mercy Ashford, not driven by duty, not bought by rank, not forced by anyone, willing. I have looked at this hand, and I will never turn away from it. I am kneeling on the gravel with you today, and I do not count the cost. And I swear to you, before God and this house, I will never send you to the back stairs when company comes." He looked up at the gray sky, his hand still holding hers, and he spoke his prayer aloud in the quiet yard. He said, "Lord, we have done what we know how to do. I have laid down my pride, and I have opened my gates. If it is your will to mend this broken house, I am asking you to start with her. I have nothing else to offer but a heart that wants to be made whole." He looked back at Mercy. He said, "Will you have me, Mercy? Not as your duke, but as your husband." Mercy looked at him. She looked at his knees in the mud. She looked at his face, which was open and unguarded, and full of a hope that was almost painful to see. She felt her mother's Bible warm against her ribs. The second test had been passed. The third was written in his eyes. She whispered, "Yes, Nicholas." From the edge of the crowd, Arabella Croft walked forward. Her face was very pale, and she had dropped her gloves on the grass. She stopped 5 paces from them, looking at Mercy's hand in the Duke's. She said, "I have been afraid, Mercy. I have been afraid of being left with nothing. I thought if he married I would have no home. I am sorry for what I said in the passage." Mercy looked at her, and the old anger was gone. She saw only a woman who had been cold because she was cold inside. Mercy said, "There is room enough in this house for us both, Miss Croft. We will not turn you out." Arabella looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, her mouth trembling, and walked back to the carriage. She did not look like a general anymore. She looked like a woman who had been let out of a prison. The house party ended that afternoon. Lady Blanchard ordered her trunks packed before luncheon, and her carriage was on the Ashbourne Road by 3 o'clock. Miss Letitia did not weep. She kissed Nicholas on both cheeks, looked at Mercy with a cool, intelligent curiosity, and said she hoped the hunting would be good in the winter. The banns were read the following Sunday. They were read 3 times, as the law required, and though the parish gossiped until the chimneys smoked, no one stood up to forbid the match. They were wed on the 1st of December, in the same estate chapel where Nicholas had knelt on the gravel. The church was filled with evergreen boughs and white candles that smelled of tallow and pine. Mrs. Farthing sat in the front pew, wearing a new bonnet of blue silk that Nicholas had bought her, her pocket handkerchief already damp before the service began. Miss Croft sat beside her, her face quiet and at peace. Mercy walked down the aisle alone. She wore a dress of plain cream silk, with no lace and no jewels, her hair simply pinned. She carried her mother's small dark Bible in her hands, her thumb marking the 16th chapter of the first book of Samuel. Nicholas met her at the altar. When the clergyman asked who gave this woman to be married, Nicholas took her hand himself. He lifted her right hand, her scarred hand, before the whole congregation. He did not try to hide it beneath her sleeve. He held it in the warm light of the candles, and he kissed the back of it, where the white ridges of the burn were deepest, before he slipped the plain gold band onto her finger. The under-butler, Billings, stood near the door, his silver tray forgotten, his eyes wet. He whispered to the head groom, "I never thought I would see this day." The groom said, "The Duke has found his sign, Billings, and we have found a mistress." After the service, they walked back to the house together through the falling snow. Garth ran before them, his great gray tail waving like a banner in the white air, his paws leaving deep prints in the drifts. Nicholas stopped at the stone arch of the stables. He looked down at Mercy, his arm tight around her waist, the snow settling on his shoulders. He said, "Your hand is cold, Duchess." She smiled up at him, her face bright in the gray light. She said, "My heart is warm, Nicholas." He led her through the stable arch, and for the first time in 13 years, Mercy Ashford did not turn toward the back stairs. She walked through the great iron-studded front doors of Aldermere Hall, her husband's hand in hers, while every servant in the house stood in the hall to welcome her home. 1 year and 3 months after the wedding, on a cold March morning when the daffodils were just breaking through the frozen ground, Mercy sat in the drawing room at Aldermere Hall with the household accounts spread open on the table before her. The fire burned warm and even in the grate. The room smelled of beeswax and lemon oil, and the faint, clean scent of the lavender sachets that hung in the linen press. Outside the tall windows, the valley was waking into spring. Beside the open ledger, exactly where it had sat every morning for the past year, lay her mother's small dark Bible. The brass clasps were polished bright. The leather was soft with age and use. Mercy had her hand resting lightly on the cover while she tallied the month's expenditure for candles and coal. Nicholas came in from the stable yard, Garth at his heels, his boots leaving faint prints of damp earth on the turkey carpet. He stopped when he saw her, and his face softened into the expression he always wore when he found her at work, half wonder, half gratitude. "You'll wear yourself out before noon," he said. Mercy looked up and smiled. "Mrs. Farthing says we've used 60 pounds of butter this month. I'm trying to work out whether the dairymaid is skimming or whether we're simply eating more." Nicholas crossed the room and leaned down to kiss the top of her head. "We're eating more. Arabella has invited half the parish to Sunday dinner every week since Candlemas. Then I'll order another churn." He sat down in the chair beside her and took her scarred hand in his. He turned it over, tracing the lines of the old burn with his thumb the way he always did, as though he were reading a map he had long since memorized. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Mercy set her pen down and placed her free hand over the gentle swell beneath her gray wool dress. "I'm well, the child is strong. He kicked me through the sermon last Sunday." "He? Or she? I don't mind which, as long as they have your patience and my mother's faith." Nicholas was silent for a moment. Then he reached across the table and drew the small Bible toward him. He opened it to the page where the brown, brittle lavender had once been pressed, and he read the verse that was underlined there in 2 hands now. Hers, in faded ink from years ago, and his, in fresh black ink from the night before their wedding. He read it aloud, quietly, as though he were saying grace. "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." He looked at her. "I have been thinking about this verse, Mercy." "Have you?" "I spent 3 years believing God had stopped listening to me, but he was listening all along. He was just answering a question I hadn't known how to ask." "What question was that?" "How to see," Nicholas said. "Not what to have. Not what to mend. Just how to see." Mercy reached across and closed her hand over his. "And do you see now, Nicholas?" "I see you," he said. "I see this house full of life again. I see Arabella laughing at table instead of keeping ledgers of who owes what to whom. I see Mrs. Farthing ordering everyone about as though she were born to it. I see a child coming who will grow up knowing that worth is written in the book, not on the skin." He lifted her hand and kissed the scarred palm. "I see everything I asked for, Mercy, and I did not know it until you prayed it plain." She smiled, her eyes bright. "Then we have both been answered." That afternoon, Mercy walked out to the stable yard with a bowl of scraps for Garth. The hound was lying in a patch of pale sunlight near the kennel door, his gray coat warm under her hand when she bent to stroke his head. The iron drop bar was still there, bolted to the frame, though the door was never closed now. Mercy rested her hand on it for a moment, remembering the cold October night when she had stood here alone and prayed for one living thing to come to her willing. She had been given the hound first, and then the Duke, and then a house, and a name, and a table where her mother's Bible sat beside the accounts as though they had always belonged together, and now a child, growing beneath her heart, who would be born into a house where no one was kept behind closed doors. She looked up at the gray Derbyshire sky, the clouds moving fast over the hills. "You sent one," she whispered, "and then you sent them all." She turned and walked back across the yard, Garth at her heels, the spring wind pulling at her skirts. She did not look back at the kennel. She looked ahead, toward the great house with its windows full of light, and the man standing in the doorway waiting for her to come home. Now I want to stop here, friend, and tell you what I think this story is really about. Mercy Ashford had been burned at 14, and she had spent the next 14 years being told, by silence, by the green baize door, by the dismissive glances of women like Lady Blanchard, that she was not the kind of woman a man of rank would ever choose. She had prayed for one living thing to come to her willing, and she had named 3 tests that no duke in his right mind ought to pass. And Nicholas Hartwell, Duke of Aldermere, passed every one of them. He looked at her hand and did not turn away. He knelt on the gravel with her in front of his entire household, and he brought her through the front door and gave her a place at his table that no one could ever take from her again. This is not a story about a woman who got lucky. This is a story about a woman who asked God for exactly what she needed, in plain words, and trusted him to answer. And it is a story about a man who had been looking in the wrong direction for 3 years, until God taught him to see the way he sees. The book says the Lord does not look on the outward appearance, he looks on the heart. And when we learn to look the way he looks, we see the people we have been walking past our whole lives. We see the worth that has been there all along, written in the book, waiting for someone to call it by name. Wherever you are in this wide world, whatever door you are standing in front of, whatever prayer you have been carrying for months or years without an answer, I am grateful you are here. Some of you are listening in your kitchens. Some of you are driving long roads alone. Some of you are lying in bed in the dark, and this story is keeping you company. I know that, because you have told me. You have written from South Africa and Australia and Canada, and small towns in Kansas and Georgia whose names I had to look up on a map. You have told me about your own unanswered prayers, and your own closed doors, and the people you loved who are gone now. I want you to know I do not take that lightly. If this story meant something to you, take 1 second and subscribe before you go. And leave a word in the comments telling me where in this wide world you are listening from. I read every one of them. It is how I know who I am talking to out here in the quiet. And if you are still waiting on an answer, I want you to remember what Mercy did. She prayed it plain. She named exactly what she needed. She did not ask for everything. She asked for one living thing to come to her willing. And when God sent it, she had the courage to recognize it. So name it plain. Ask for what you need, not for what you think you are allowed to want. And when the answer comes, and it will come, friend, in God's time and in His way, do not turn away from it because it does not look the way you thought it would. Keep asking, keep working, keep believing.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoy clean stories of faith, survival, and restoration, hit the subscribe button because we have so many more coming for you. Listen to our stories and you'll see prayers get answered, faith springing to courage and action. You'll see miracles happen for the people who believe and trust in God. Do check our other amazing videos. See you in the next one.